Sophia had never needed anyone. At 27, she ran a company most executives twice her age couldn't manage, made decisions that moved markets, and slept exactly 6 hours every night without a single regret. She did not flinch. She did not ask for help, and she certainly did not accept charity, not from her board, not from her investors, and not from the quiet, unremarkable security guard her father had just assigned to live with her. His name was Julian. He wore plain clothes. He said almost nothing. He was, by every visible measure, completely ordinary. Sophia was wrong. What would you do if the person you had written off turned out to be the only one who could save you? Nexus Technology Solutions had grown 38% in the past fiscal year alone. That number, carved into the glass lobby wall in frosted letters, was Sophia Harmon's personal declaration of war against every person who had ever doubted her. The company specialized in proprietary data security infrastructure, the kind governments quietly paid for and competitors quietly stole. Sophia had built it from a $70,000 inheritance and a fury she had never fully explained to anyone. She wore charcoal blazers. She carried a black leather folio everywhere. Her employees did not stop to chat with her in the hallway. They moved aside and stared at their shoes until she passed. She was not cruel. She was simply a woman who had learned, at some cost, that warmth was a vector for betrayal. That lesson had come 6 years earlier, in the form of a former business partner named Derek Holt. They had co-founded a smaller firm together in their early 20s, Derek with his charm and connections, Sophia with her code and her precision. For 2 years, she had trusted him completely. She had shown him every internal system, every vulnerability, every corner of her professional life. When he dissolved the partnership and walked directly to their largest competitor with everything she had built, Sophia did not cry. She did not confront him publicly. She simply closed the door to her apartment for a weekend, came out on Monday morning with a new incorporation filing and a permanent policy: trust no one with access to what matters. By the time she was 27, that policy had made her very successful and very alone, and she considered both outcomes entirely acceptable. Her father, Alexander Harmon, did not consider them acceptable. Alexander was 61 years old, a silver-haired man who had spent 30 years building his own real estate empire before semi-retiring and pouring a significant portion of his capital into Sophia's company. He was not a passive investor. He attended board meetings. He reviewed quarterly financials, and lately, he had been receiving information through channels he did not share with Sophia that certain people were paying very close attention to his daughter. Sophia's refusal to carry personal security had always annoyed him. Now it frightened him. He presented his case over dinner at his townhouse on a Tuesday evening in late October. The proposal was, by Sophia's estimation, completely unreasonable. An independent security contractor, not a corporate team, not a badge and building hire, but a single individual would be assigned to her. He would live in the secondary unit connected to her home. He would be present, within reasonable distance, at nearly all times. Sophia set down her fork. She explained, in the measured tone she used for particularly incompetent board presentations, that she had a security system, a verified building staff, and no history of credible threats that warranted this level of disruption to her life. She did not need a babysitter. She especially did not need one installed inside her home. Alexander slid a single printed page across the table. It documented 3 incidents in the past 45 days. A vehicle registered to a known industrial espionage firm parked outside her office building on 2 separate occasions. A phishing attempt targeting her personal email, not her corporate address, her personal one that had been caught by her system but bore the signature of a highly sophisticated operation. And a name: Victor Crane, the current managing director of Ashford Capital, a rival firm that had lost 3 major government contracts to Nexus in the past year. Sophia read the page once. She folded it and slid it back. She still said no. Alexander had anticipated this. He did not argue further that evening. But 3 days later, Sophia arrived home from the office to find a man sitting in the small garden courtyard of her building, a child asleep against his shoulder, and a single duffel bag on the ground beside his boots. He looked up when she approached. Dark eyes, completely still. His name was Julian Mercer. He was 34 years old, according to the brief profile her father's assistant had emailed her that afternoon. Former contractor, currently self-employed. Single father, one daughter, age 6. Sophia stared at him for a full 3 seconds without speaking. Then she looked at her father's assistant's email again and confirmed that yes, this was the man Alexander Harmon had hired to protect the CEO of a $40 million data security firm. She called her father immediately. He did not answer. He sent a single text message, "Give it 2 weeks, then we'll talk." Sophia understood, in that moment, that her father had structured this so that removing Julian would require a formal process, one that would alert the board, raise questions, and create exactly the kind of noise she had spent years avoiding. He had used her own company's governance against her. She stood in her courtyard with her phone in her hand, and the weight of the situation settling over her like concrete. "You have the secondary unit," she said to Julian. Her voice was even. "There are rules. You do not enter my primary space without permission. You do not speak to my colleagues or staff about anything you observe here. You do not interfere in my schedule." She paused, and whatever that is, she glanced briefly at the sleeping child. "It stays quiet." Julian looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. That was the entire first conversation. The next morning, Sophia encountered Julian in the shared garden at 6:43. He was already awake, standing near the far edge of the courtyard with a coffee cup, not looking at his phone, not doing anything in particular, just standing, alert in a way that felt odd for that hour and for someone who had no apparent reason to be watchful. She acknowledged him with nothing more than a nod and walked to her car. She told herself she noticed nothing unusual about him. This was not quite true. Julian Mercer was not what Sophia's mental model of a security contractor looked like. The corporate security professionals she had worked with over the years were typically polished. They wore earpieces, they carried notepads, they used words like protocol and perimeter sweep. They performed their competence loudly because performance was how they justified their contracts. Julian did none of that. He wore dark gray trousers and plain long-sleeved shirts. He carried nothing visible. When he spoke, which was rare, his sentences were short and specific, stripped of any word that wasn't load-bearing. He did not fill silence. He seemed, in fact, completely comfortable with silence, which Sophia found simultaneously appropriate and slightly unnerving. On the third day, she came home to find his daughter in the courtyard. Luna was 6 years old and small for her age, with dark curly hair and enormous brown eyes that tracked movement the way cautious animals do. She was sitting on the stone bench with a stuffed rabbit in her lap, its ears worn soft from handling, and she was drawing something in a small notebook. When Sophia entered through the gate, Luna looked up and went absolutely still. Sophia stopped. They regarded each other for a moment. Sophia did not know what to do with children. They operated outside her areas of competence. She gave the girl a brief, neutral nod, the same one she gave to junior analysts, and walked toward her door. "She doesn't bite," Julian's voice came from behind her. He had appeared from the secondary unit doorway without a sound. "She's just shy." "I didn't assume otherwise," Sophia said without turning around. She went inside and did not think about the girl's enormous, watchful eyes for the rest of the evening. Or so she told herself. The friction between Sophia and Julian was not explosive. It was quiet and persistent, like a low-grade electrical current. Sophia had rules. Julian followed them to the letter, which somehow made her more irritated, not less, because it gave her nothing to correct. She had expected pushback, petty violations, the kind of low-level territorial behavior she was accustomed to managing. Instead, she got a man who was simply present, who never explained himself, who watched everything. She caught him watching the street from the second-floor window of his unit one evening, not in an obvious way, not with anything visible in his hands, but with the particular quality of attention she recognized from certain former military consultants she had brought in for infrastructure risk assessment. The kind of watching that wasn't casual. She noted it and said nothing. On day 5, she came home to find that Julian had rearranged the potted plants along the courtyard entrance. It appeared at first glance to be a minor aesthetic change. On closer inspection, the new arrangement eliminated 2 blind spots she hadn't consciously registered. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, processing this. She did not ask him about it. She did not want to give him the satisfaction of knowing she had noticed. But she had noticed. The household rhythms that developed over the first week were awkward and, Sophia had to admit, relatively functional. Julian made no noise before 6 in the morning. She had not asked him to do this, but he seemed to understand her schedule from observation. Luna, for her part, had developed a habit of playing quietly in whatever space her father was in and going completely silent if Sophia appeared nearby. The child seemed to read adult moods with a sensitivity that suggested she had spent a great deal of time being careful around them. That observation lodged itself somewhere in Sophia's mind and stayed there. On the 8th day, she saw Julian and Luna in the courtyard after dinner. She had not intended to observe them. She was passing by a window and simply paused. Julian was sitting on the stone bench with Luna in his lap, reading to her from a picture book. His voice was too low to hear through the glass, but his entire posture had changed. The vigilance she associated with him during the day had not disappeared. She suspected it never fully did, but something in him had softened around the edges. He was patient with Luna's interruptions. He pointed at pictures. He made a face that made her laugh, and he smiled in a way that rearranged his features completely. Sophia stood at the window for approximately 8 seconds. Then she stepped back and returned to her laptop. She had a quarterly board presentation to prepare and 2 pending contract negotiations to finalize. She did not have time to think about the domestic life of a man she had not chosen to have in her home. She opened her spreadsheet and returned to her numbers. The numbers were safe. The numbers made sense. Julian Mercer did not make sense, and that was a problem she had not yet found a way to file correctly. The first time it happened, Sophia almost dismissed it. She was being driven to a meeting at a midtown hotel, Julian behind the wheel, Luna at school for the day, when he made a sudden turn onto a side street without any instruction from her. Sophia looked up from her documents. "That's not the route," she said. "There's a vehicle that has followed us from the garage," he said. "Dark blue sedan, out-of-state plates. It has been maintaining exactly 4 car lengths for the past 11 blocks. Sophia looked in the rearview mirror. She saw nothing useful. She was not trained to see what he was seeing. "You're certain?" "Yes." He took 3 more turns in a pattern she recognized as a surveillance detection route. She knew the term from a corporate espionage seminar she had attended 2 years ago. By the 4th turn, the sedan was gone. He pulled back onto the main avenue and delivered her to the hotel entrance exactly 4 minutes late. She sat in the car for a moment before getting out. "Have you done this before?" she asked. "Driven?" he said. She looked at him. He was not being obtuse. His expression was completely neutral. She could not tell if it was deflection or simply his natural delivery. She got out of the car without pursuing it. Inside the meeting, her attention was divided for the first time in years. Over the following days, she began cataloging. She was a woman who organized information professionally, and Julian had become, whether she liked it or not, a data problem she needed to understand. She began noting the specifics. He identified a man photographing her building entrance from a parked car and reported it to her quietly, without alarm, providing the vehicle make, partial plate, and estimated time the car had arrived on the block, information that, when she checked against what her corporate security team could gather, was more precise than anything they produced. He spotted a tampered lock on the service door of the building, not forced, but manipulated in a way that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. He said nothing about it until he had already had it replaced. He read rooms. At a company function she allowed him to attend as peripheral security, she watched him process the space within 30 seconds of arrival exits, sight lines, positions of unfamiliar faces. He had done it so naturally that no one else in the room had registered it happening. She registered it because she had been watching him specifically. His hands were scarred. Not uniformly, not in the way of factory or kitchen work, but in the discrete, specific pattern that suggested long-term training with certain equipment. She had seen that pattern once before, on a retired federal agent who had consulted for Nexus on penetration testing. She started asking questions. "Where were you before this?" she asked on a Wednesday evening. Catching him in the kitchen with Luna, he was cutting an apple with the kind of automatic, unhurried precision that people develop after doing something the same way for a very long time. "Private contracting," he said. Before that, a pause. "Service. Branche?" He handed Luna a piece of apple. "Does it matter for the job?" "I'm asking," she said. He turned slightly toward her. Not defensive, measured. "Army," he said. "Long time ago." She waited. He said nothing further. Luna accepted the apple slice and returned to her drawing without looking up. That evening, Sophia ran his name through the professional background check service Nexus used for executive hires. Julian Mercer. The results were sparse in a specific way. He had a valid Social Security record, a driver's license, a brief employment history with 2 private security firms, one domestic, one with offices in 3 countries, and then nothing. The employment history stopped 5 years ago. Before that, the record was thin and oddly generic, the kind of thin that does not come from a person who simply didn't do very much, but from a person whose history had been carefully managed. She had seen this before, once, in the file of a defense contractor who had done covert work for a government agency and whose civilian identity had been partially constructed for operational purposes. She did not sleep well that night. The following afternoon, she was working in the living area when she heard a sound from the courtyard that was not right, a scrape, a specific weight distribution on the stone path that she could not have articulated, but that her body registered before her mind did. She was already turning when Julian came through the door, positioned himself between her and the window, and said, "Inside. Now." It took 40 seconds. A man she had never seen before passed the courtyard entrance, paused, and continued. Julian watched until the street was clear. Then he stepped back and said, "Someone doing reconnaissance. He has been passed once before. Different clothes." Sophia's heart was beating faster than she wanted it to. "How did you know I was in danger?" "I didn't know you were in danger," he said. "I knew someone was gathering information. Those aren't always the same thing. But I'd rather treat them the same way." There was a pause. "Who are you?" she asked. She kept her voice even, but something in the question had moved below her professional register into something more direct than she was accustomed to being. Julian looked at her for a long moment. "Someone doing a job," he said. He went back to the courtyard. Sophia stood in the center of her living room, a woman who controlled $40 million of infrastructure and a team of 217 people, and realized for the first time in years that she was in a situation she did not fully understand. Julian was not who his file said he was. He was also, demonstrably, protecting her with a level of skill that her father's money hadn't simply purchased at a standard security firm. The question was why someone with that level of training was living in a secondary unit off a garden courtyard, reading picture books to a 6-year-old and calling it private contracting. She did not have an answer. That bothered her more than almost anything else. The breach happened on a Thursday. Sophia's chief technology officer, a meticulous woman named Dana Fowler, flagged it at 9:40 in the morning, an internal access log, showing a data query on the government contract specifications, the ones related to Nexus's highest-level infrastructure client run, from credentials belonging to a mid-level senior engineer named Patrick Ellison. The query had happened at 2:14 in the morning, when Patrick Ellison was, according to his building access records, not in the office. Sophia was in the conference room with Dana and their head of internal security within 12 minutes of the notification. She did not raise her voice. She did not express panic. She identified the scope of the potential leak, issued a credential lockdown on the affected systems, and directed Dana to isolate the compromised network segment before anyone outside that room had time to understand what was happening. She was very good in a crisis. What she could not fully contain was the scale of the implication. If someone had Patrick's credentials and remote access to the internal system, they had either compromised the network perimeter or they had help from inside. Patrick Ellison had been with Nexus for 3 years. He had excellent reviews. He had also, Sophia now recalled, had lunch twice in the past month, with a man she had seen in the lobby once and not thought about again. She pulled security footage. The man's face was familiar in an abstract way, the kind of familiar that means you have seen someone in a context so unmemorable that you filed them away as background. She sent the image to Julian. His response came in under 4 minutes. The man's name was Raymond Taft, a former employee of Ashford Capital's intelligence division. He had left, or appeared to have left the firm 8 months ago. Julian included the information with no explanation of how he had obtained it. Sophia stared at the message for a long moment. She did not ask. Victor Crane was making his move. She had known this was coming. The documentation her father had shown her, the vehicle sightings, the phishing attempt, but she had been managing it at the intelligence level, treating it as corporate espionage she could contain through countermeasures and legal channels. What the breach told her was that the operation was already inside her walls. Someone she had trusted with network access had been turned. The rest of that day was controlled chaos, internal audit, credential review, forensic analysis of every access log for the past 60 days. By 7 in the evening, Sophia had identified 3 additional queries that had been masked more carefully than the first, all running on Patrick's access during off hours. She had also identified that Patrick had been under financial pressure for the past 4 months, a fact her HR system had not flagged because no one had thought to look. She did not go home until 10 that night. Julian was in the courtyard when she arrived. Luna was inside, and asleep. She could see the light off in the secondary unit's upper window. He was standing near the entrance, exactly where he always stood when he was waiting for her. She had not told him she was coming home late. He had waited anyway. She walked past him without speaking. She was halfway to her door when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered without thinking a decision. She regretted the moment she heard the voice. It was a man she didn't recognize, speaking in a tone so deliberately calm it was its own kind of threat. He told her that what had happened today was not an accident and not the end. He told her she had 48 hours to consider a meeting. He told her the next step would be less surgical. Sophia ended the call. Her hands were still. She turned around. Julian was already standing 3 feet away. He had moved from the far end of the courtyard to her position in complete silence, and he was reading her face with the same total attention he used to read streets. "Threat call?" he said. She looked at him. "How did you—" "Your posture changed," he said simply. "What did they say?" She told him. He listened without expression. When she finished, there was a moment of silence that was different from his usual silence. It had a different texture, a quality of assessment rather than reserve. "They'll move tonight," he said. "Or very close to it. The call isn't a negotiation. It's a countdown. You can't know that. I've seen this before," he said. She wanted to ask where, when, in what capacity. She didn't. Something about the certainty in his voice locked the question out. "Go inside," he said. "Lock everything. I need to make a call. You need to—" Sophia. It was the first time he had used her name without professional distance. It stopped her. "Please, go inside." She went inside. She sat on her couch and listened to silence and tried to feel like a CEO and not like someone being hunted. The attempt was only partially successful. At 1:23 in the morning, she was still awake when she heard a sound from the courtyard that was wrong. Not loud, just wrong. She moved to the edge of the window. There were 2 of them. She registered that much before Julian appeared from a shadow she had not realized contained him. What happened next lasted less than 30 seconds. She watched it through the glass with a kind of cold, suspended disbelief, because the person she was watching was not the quiet, contained man who read picture books to his daughter and drank coffee in the morning garden. The person she was watching moved with a precision and economy that was not amateur, not defensive, and not anything close to what a basic security contractor was trained to do. Both men were restrained before she had fully processed that it was over. Julian stood up. He was breathing normally. He straightened his sleeve, looked toward her window, and gave a single nod. Sophia stepped back from the glass. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she had absolutely no idea what to do next. She did not sleep. By the time the sky outside her window had grayed from black to the flat, diffuse light of early morning, Sophia had moved through several distinct emotional registers, all of them unfamiliar, and arrived at the only response her psychology had ever produced under genuine uncertainty: investigation. She opened her laptop and went back to Julian's background report. The second time through, she read it differently. What she had initially processed as sparse now read as shaped. The 2 private security firms listed in his employment history were both legitimate companies. She had verified this before, But when she mapped their known clients and operational geographies against each other, a pattern emerged. Both firms had contracts in regions and for clients that typically employed people with government security clearances well above standard corporate level. The dates of his employment with each firm were clean and specific, but the gap between his military service and his first private employment was 3 years long, and those 3 years had produced no records at all. Not few records, none. She pulled the names of both firms' principals and cross-referenced them against known defense industry networks. The second firm's founder had a documented history as a liaison for a joint task force involving federal intelligence operations. This was not publicly advertised, but it was in a conference proceedings document from 8 years ago that had been partially redacted in the public version, and Sophia had access, through a Nexus security clearance, to the unredacted version. She read the unredacted document at 3:40 in the morning, with her coffee going cold beside her. The scars on Julian's hands were not from extended training with standard equipment. She had misidentified them. They were the specific pattern left by certain kinds of tactical fieldwork, the kind conducted in non-standard conditions over extended periods. She had seen that specific pattern described in a training manual that Nexus had been given access to during a government contract consultation, and she had not identified it earlier because she had not been looking for it. She had been looking for a simple lie. The truth was more complicated than a lie. She built the picture methodically, the way she built financial models, one verified element at a time, each constraining what the next could be. Julian Mercer was a name. The man using it had a military background that preceded his paper record, a period of employment with security firms operating at the intelligence boundary, and then a sudden and complete exit from that world 5 years ago. Concurrent with a daughter who was now 6 years old. Luna had been approximately 1 year old when Julian's employment records ceased. The timing was not coincidental. Something had happened, something that had made a man operating at that level pack up, step out, and become, as far as the record was concerned, an ordinary private contractor reading picture books in a garden courtyard. At 6:15, she heard him moving in the courtyard. She went outside. He looked at her face and immediately understood she had not slept. She looked at his face and confirmed he already knew she had been pulling information. They stood in the early cold for a moment, without speaking. "I know your record is managed," she said. "I know what a managed record looks like, and yours is one. I know the 2 firms you worked for operate at the intelligence level. I know there are 3 years missing before that." She paused. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I just need to understand what is happening in my life." Julian was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of someone building a deflection, the quiet of someone making a decision. "I'm not going to give you a full briefing on my history," he said finally. "Not yet. But I can tell you that nothing you're in the middle of right now is beyond what I'm trained to handle. And I can tell you that your father knew exactly what he was getting when he hired me." Sophia felt the small, cold click of confirmation. Alexander had not simply hired a security contractor from a random firm. He had found Julian specifically, which meant Alexander knew precisely who Julian was. "Why the cover?" she asked. "Because the people coming after you aren't expecting someone with my background. If they know I'm here, they prepare differently. The cover isn't to fool you, it's to fool them." She processed this. "And the rest of your file?" He met her eyes. "Is mine." There was a firmness in that statement that was not aggression. It was the kind of boundary she recognized from people who had earned the right to it, through something she did not yet fully understand. She did not push it. "Last night," she said, "those 2 men, handled, documented, authorities will have them by this afternoon. I contacted someone who will process it without public exposure for you or Nexus." "You have contacts in law enforcement?" "Yes. Federal, among others." She stood very still in the cold morning air, recalibrating every assumption she had built about this situation, since the evening she had found him sitting in her courtyard with his daughter asleep against his shoulder. "You could have told me this at the beginning," she said. There was no accusation in her voice. She was genuinely asking. "You wouldn't have accepted the cover story if I had," he said, "and you would have pushed back harder on having me here. Your father was clear that removing me had to be your choice. Freely made, not something you engineered before you understood the threat." She thought about this. She thought about her father, 61 years old, looking at security intelligence about people circling his daughter, and deciding that the most effective protection he could give her was a man who could blend entirely into the ordinary world while being completely extraordinary within it. She thought about the fact that she had spent 8 days treating Julian as an unwanted imposition, when he had spent those same 8 days keeping her alive without her knowledge. "Your daughter," she said quietly. "Luna doesn't know any of this." Something moved behind his eyes very briefly, very controlled. "No," he said. "She knows her dad keeps people safe. That's all she needs to know." There was a silence. "I need to know everything you've observed," Sophia said finally. "Everything relevant to the crane operation. We worked together on this. No more information gaps." Julian looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. It was the longest conversation they had ever had. Victor Crane made his final move on a Saturday evening. Sophia had spent the 2 days since her early morning conversation with Julian in a different operational mode. Not slower, not softer, but more precise. They had mapped the Crane network together. Julian providing intelligence from sources he did not name, but whose accuracy she could no longer question. And Sophia providing the corporate architecture, the financial patterns, and the exact shape of what Crane was trying to extract. It was an efficient collaboration of most of the friction that had characterized the first week. She asked precise questions. He gave precise answers. They did not waste each other's time. She had also, in those same 2 days, had 3 conversations with Luna. The first was accidental. Sophia came into the kitchen for water at 9 in the evening and found Luna sitting at the table with her stuffed rabbit, unable to sleep, and they had spent approximately 12 minutes in the same space without it being awkward, which was not something Sophia had expected. The second was deliberate on the child's part. Luna had appeared at the connecting door with a drawing she had made and held it out to Sophia with the expression of someone making a significant social overture. Sophia had accepted the drawing and said it was good. Luna had looked at her with those enormous eyes for a moment and then smiled so completely that it changed the whole temperature of the room. The third conversation was brief but carried weight. Luna had asked Sophia what she did all day, and Sophia had explained simply that she ran a company. Luna had considered this and said, "Like a boss?" And Sophia had said, "Yes, like a boss." And Luna had nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to her drawing. Sophia had kept the drawing. She did not think too carefully about why. On Saturday evening, she was working from home, Julian nearby. Documents spread across her dining table when her phone rang. It was her building's lobby security system. Delivery pickup, wrong address. Could she come down to verify? It was not a call her building system made. The building used a standard app notification, not a phone call. She had never received a phone call from lobby security in 2 years of living there. She looked up at Julian. He was already on his feet. "Don't go down," he said. "I wasn't going to," she said. In the next 4 minutes, Julian made 3 calls in rapid succession. The last one lasted less than 60 seconds. And when it ended, he turned to her and said, "They've moved 2 people into the building through the service entrance. They're on their way up. Someone inside gave them access." He moved toward her with a precision that was deliberate and pre-planned. "There's a secondary exit through the maintenance corridor. We go now." They went. Luna was in her room, and Julian's first action was his daughter. He had her in his arms, blanket and rabbit and all, before Sophia had crossed the threshold of the secondary unit. That action, executed without hesitation, without a breath of calculation, the child came first. Automatically, the way breathing came first, told Sophia something about Julian Mercer that no intelligence file could have communicated. They moved through the maintenance corridor. Julian ahead, Sophia close, Luna pressed against his shoulder with her eyes open and frightened and silent, because she was a child who had learned to be silent in difficult moments. That knowledge settled over Sophia like a weight. In the building's lower service level, they were met by 2 individuals who Julian clearly knew they communicated in the clipped, minimal code of people who have worked together under pressure before. They moved Sophia and Luna into a vehicle while Julian stayed behind. "I'll be 10 minutes, he said to Luna. He touched her face. "Stay with Sophia." Luna looked at him with enormous eyes. She nodded. He looked at Sophia briefly, not a request, not an instruction, just a look that carried everything that hadn't been said yet. Then he turned back into the building. Sophia sat in the vehicle with a 6-year-old pressed against her side, clutching a stuffed rabbit, and did something she had not done in the presence of another person in 6 years. She put her arm around the child and held on. What Julian did inside the building in the next 11 minutes was not something Sophia witnessed in full. She received it in pieces afterward from Julian himself, from one of the 2 individuals who had been waiting in the vehicle, and from a brief report that appeared in a restricted federal incident log she had been granted access to, which did not use Julian's name, but described a subject with a profile she recognized immediately. 2 men had entered the building. Victor Crane's operatives, both with records of private security work in environments where the work was not legal. Julian had encountered them in the service corridor, on ground that was narrow and closed, and that a person with standard training would have considered a disadvantage. He had not considered it a disadvantage. The encounter lasted a very short time. Neither man was seriously injured. They were restrained and held for federal retrieval, but the efficiency with which it was done was not civilian, not amateur, and not explainable by anything in the professional file her father's assistant had emailed her 3 weeks ago. When Julian came back to the vehicle 11 minutes after he had left, his expression was the same as always. He checked Luna first, then Sophia, then the surrounding street. In that order. "We're moving to a different location tonight," he said. "Your people will manage the scene?" Sophia asked. "Yes, Julian." She said his name the way he had said hers, without distance. "What exactly did you do before this?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was part of a joint operations unit," he said. "Federal and military, combined function. Counterintelligence, primarily. High-value asset protection. I did it for 9 years. And then, Luna's mother died," he said. "Workplace incident. She was in the same line of work." His voice was level, and the levelness of it cost him something visible at the edges. "Luna was 13 months old. I handed in my credentials 6 weeks later." Sophia said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not be less than the weight of what he had just described. "Your father knew all of this," Julian continued. "When he came looking for protection for you, a contact of his had worked alongside me. He reached out. I said yes because the work mattered, and because Luna needed me to have something to do that wasn't just being afraid for her." Sophia looked at him. For the first time since she was 21 years old, she felt the specific vertigo of seeing another person clearly, not their surface, not their profile, their actual shape. A man who had operated at the highest level of protective intelligence, who had walked away from all of it for a 13-month-old girl, who had lived quietly in the space between who he had been and who his daughter needed him to be, and who had, without announcement, stepped back into that first person on her behalf. She had spent 8 days treating him as an inconvenience. He had spent 8 days treating her life as worth protecting. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," he said. That was all. In the days that followed, Sophia did something she was not practiced at. She adjusted. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden warmth of a person who had simply forgotten to be open and now remembered. That was not who she was. But the recalibration was real. She could feel it happening, like the slow correction of a bearing that had been running slightly off for a long time. She had built her entire professional identity on the premise that control was safety. Julian's existence, specifically, his choice to surrender the kind of control she admired most in order to raise his daughter, was a direct argument against that premise. She did not know what to do with it yet, but she stopped dismissing it. She began telling him things. Not confessions, not emotional revelations. She was not built for those, and had no interest in performing them. She told him how the Crane situation had developed over the past year. She told him about Derek Holt, briefly and without particular feeling, because it was relevant context, and because she found, unexpectedly, that it did not feel like exposure to say it out loud to this specific person. She told him that her company was not simply a company to her, it was the rebuilt version of something that had been taken, and every year it grew was a year the original theft mattered less. Julian listened. He did not offer advice she had not asked for. He did not reflect her feelings back at her in the way she found intolerable from most people, the performed empathy that was really just a mirror aimed at itself. He simply listened, and occasionally said something that was true and specific and had clearly been considered before being spoken. She found herself valuing those intervals more than she expected. She spent time with Luna. This happened gradually, in the organic way that things happen when proximity allows them to. Luna had decided, by some internal calculation that Sophia was never informed of, that Sophia was safe. The girl began appearing at the edge of whatever room Sophia was working in, not asking for attention, just present, drawing in her notebook, or arranging small objects on the floor in patterns that seemed to have private significance. Sophia found, against expectation, that the presence was not disruptive. Luna's quietness was not the silence of absence, but the silence of a child fully occupied with her own interior world, which had a kind of weight and realness to it that Sophia respected. She brought Luna a new notebook, a better one, heavy paper, proper binding. She left it on the kitchen counter, without comment. Luna found it that morning and looked at Sophia with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated joy that Sophia had to look back at her laptop to prevent herself from doing something embarrassing. Julian saw the exchange from the doorway. He said nothing about it. Later that evening, he made coffee and left a second cup on the counter near Sophia's workspace, a gesture that was simple, and that meant, without performance, that he saw her. She drank it. The dynamic between them had shifted without arriving at a new definition. They were not friends. The word felt reductive and inaccurate. They were not employer and employee. Or not only that, what they were was something that had emerged from shared high pressure and mutual recognition, the kind of thing that forms between people who have been in actual danger together and come out on the other side with a clear understanding of who the other person is in the hard moments. He did not romanticize her. He did not soften her edges or pretend they were not edges. He spoke to her as an equal, with the specific, unaffected directness of someone who has worked alongside highly competent people and knows how to meet them where they are. She did not know when she had last experienced that. One evening she found him in the courtyard after Luna was asleep, sitting on the stone bench in the dark, and she brought her own coffee and sat at the other end of the bench, and they were quiet together for a while, without it being uncomfortable. The city made its low nighttime sound around them. The lights were on in the upper windows of the neighboring buildings. "You gave up a lot," she said eventually. "I got something back," he said. "Luna." "Yes." And he paused. The chance to do the work without losing sight of what the work is for. She thought about that. She thought about her own company built from betrayal, maintained through isolation, running on the premise that connection was a liability. She thought about the drawing Luna had given her that was still on her desk, slightly crooked against the edge of her monitor. "I built a company on not trusting people," she said. "I know," he said. "That might have been a mistake." He looked at her steadily. "Might have been," he agreed. She had the distinct impression he was not talking only about the company. She did not respond to that, but she did not look away either, which was, for Sophia Harmon, as close to an answer as it was possible to give. The unraveling of the crane operation took 2 weeks from the night of the building incident. Julian's federal contacts moved quickly once they had the operatives who had entered the building and the documentation Sophia and Julian had assembled together, the access logs, the financial patterns, the network map, the recorded threat call. Victor Crane did not go quietly. He had lawyers and resources, and 3 days of public denials that were very polished and very ineffective against the weight of evidence that had been building for months. Nexus's legal team filed in federal court. The civil component alone, the trade secret theft, the network intrusion, the compromised credentials, was enough to cost Crane's firm its government contract eligibility for the foreseeable future. Patrick Ellison cooperated fully once the evidence was presented to him. He had been financially coerced, not the first time Sophia had seen that particular vector, and he was remorseful in a way that she found genuine if not sufficient. She did not destroy him. She removed his access, ended his contract, and referred the matter to the appropriate channels. She did not take pleasure in it. She took note of the fact that she did not take pleasure in it, which was itself a change. Dana Fowler, her chief technology officer, spent 4 days running the most rigorous internal security audit in Nexus's history, and came out the other side with a report that was 42 pages long and deeply unpleasant to read. Sophia read every page. The company's vulnerability had not come from its code or its infrastructure. It had come from insufficient attention to the human layer of security, the people, the relationships, the spaces where trust had not been built because she had designed the culture to function without it. She held a staff meeting on the day the Crane matter was formally resolved. She stood in front of 217 people and said something she had not planned to say, something that arrived fully formed only as she began speaking. She told them that the company's strength had always been its technical precision, that this remained true, but that she had made a structural error in treating the people who carried that precision as a liability to be managed rather than a foundation to be supported. She intended to correct it. 217 people looked at her. Several of them looked surprised. Dana Fowler, in the front row, gave the smallest possible nod. Sophia considered it a beginning. Alexander Harmon came to dinner at her home the following Sunday. He arrived to find Julian in the kitchen and Luna at the table with her notebook, and he absorbed the scene with an expression of studied neutrality that fooled no one. He shook Julian's hand with the particular warmth of a man who has arranged something correctly and is pleased to see it landing well. Sophia told her father, over dinner, that she forgave him for the maneuver he had run. She said it without irony. He smiled into his wine. Julian was not staying indefinitely. The Crane threat was neutralized, the assignment was structurally complete, and he was, at his core, a man who did not overstay his purpose. He did not say this out loud. Neither did Sophia, but it was present between them in the way of things that are real and therefore do not require announcement. What was also present unannounced, unfinished, but undeniable was something else. A version of the future that was different from the one Sophia had been building alone. Not softer, not less ambitious, but wider, with room in it for a small girl who drew pictures and asked two wise questions, and for a man who had sacrificed everything for the right reasons and was only now, quietly, beginning to understand that sacrifice did not have to be permanent. Sophia did not know what to call it yet. She was not someone who named things before she understood them. But on the last evening of October, she sat in her courtyard with a coffee she hadn't made herself, a child asleep somewhere above her, and the company of a man who saw her exactly as she was and had chosen, for reasons that were his own, to be here anyway. The city moved around them. The air was cold. She was not afraid. She was not in control. She was not alone. For the first time in a very long time, she thought that might be enough.